Dad stepped onto the porch and leaned close. You can't come tonight. You'll embarrass us. My face went hot. I was holding a wrapped gift for Luke, my brother, whose engagement party I'd just been turned away from. My dress uniform sat folded in the trunk of my car. My name is Maya Reynolds. I'm a U.S. Army medic. I wish I could say it began there, but it started hours earlier. That afternoon, I was in my kitchen pressing a dress. The iron moved slowly over dark fabric, steam rising in careful lines. Nothing flashy, just something clean and appropriate for my brother's engagement party. I wanted to show up looking respectful, make a quiet appearance, congratulate Luke and his fiancée, and leave without drawing attention. I'd rehearsed it in my mind, smile, hug my brother, shake hands with his future in-laws, slip out before dessert. Simple, invisible, safe. The phone rang. Mom's voice came through clipped and urgent, the way it did when she was managing something she considered delicate. "Hold on," she said, and I heard her hand the phone to Dad. Dad cleared his throat. That particular sound he made before delivering news he knew I wouldn't like. "We need to talk about tonight." I set the iron upright and waited. "Luke's fiancée comes from a very particular family," he said. "They have standards, high standards, and we need everything to go smoothly tonight. First impressions matter, and we can't afford any complications." I kept my voice steady, the way I'd learned to do in briefings when the situation was deteriorating. "I understand. The thing is," he continued, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully, "you don't really fit the image they're expecting. Your presence could complicate things. It's better if you sit this one out. Just this once." I felt the words land, sharp and specific. Your presence? Complicate things. I set the iron down. I could come briefly, just to congratulate Luke and leave before dinner. "No," Dad said, his voice firmer now. "It's better if you don't come at all. We'll explain that you had duty. They'll understand that." I could have argued. I could have reminded him that Luke was my brother, that I'd been planning to attend for weeks, that I'd already bought a gift, that I'd requested the evening off 2 months in advance specifically for this. I could have pointed out that lying about duty was the kind of thing that made me uncomfortable, the kind of thing they'd taught me was wrong when I was growing up. But I knew how this worked. Arguing would only prove I was the problem they'd warned about. "All right," I said. "Thank you for understanding," Dad said, and hung up. After I hung up, the kitchen felt too quiet. The radiator ticked. Traffic hummed outside my window. I looked at the dress I'd been pressing, the careful crease down the front, the attention I'd given to making sure everything was right. I thought about the time I'd spent choosing something that would blend in, that wouldn't draw any attention, that would let me slip through the evening without anyone noticing I was there. I thought about the garment bag in my trunk, my dress uniform, polished shoes, insignia I'd earned year after year through deployments and training rotations and long shifts in field hospitals where the decisions came fast and the margins were thin. I hadn't planned to wear it to family events. I never did. The uniform represented work, duty, a part of my life. I kept separate because it seemed to make people uncomfortable, my parents especially. I wanted peace, not attention. I wanted to be part of my family without my career being the thing that defined me or divided us. I paused in the doorway, closed my eyes, and prayed for a steady heart. I asked God to help me choose restraint on purpose, not out of fear. I asked for wisdom to know when to speak and when to stay silent, for the strength to hold my boundaries without bitterness. Then I grabbed my keys. I wasn't going to defy them. Defiance would give them exactly the story they expected. Maya making a scene, Maya causing problems, Maya unable to respect reasonable requests. But I could still drop off the gift, a simple silver frame Luke had admired when he visited my apartment last month. We'd been looking at old photos, and he'd picked up the frame from my bookshelf, turned it over in his hands, said it was exactly the kind of thing he'd want for his own place someday. I could wish him well and leave quietly. That felt like something I could do without making things worse. When I pulled up to my parents' house, I could hear soft music and laughter even before I got out of the car. Luxury cars, lined the street, makes and models I didn't recognize, the kind that came with drivers and monthly detailing appointments. I parked at the end of the block and walked toward the door with the wrapped frame in my hands, my breath visible in the January air. The porch lights were on, bright and welcoming. Through the front window, I could see people in formal clothes, champagne glasses catching the light, everyone arranged in comfortable clusters the way people do at parties when they already know each other. Mom met me on the porch before I could knock. She must have been watching for my car, must have positioned herself to intercept. She glanced past me toward the lit room and asked what I was doing there, her voice low and tight. "I'm not staying," I said, lifting the gift slightly. "I just wanted Luke to get this." "It's not appropriate," she said. "We talked about this. You're putting us in a terrible position by showing up after we specifically asked you not to." Dad appeared behind her, his practiced smile dropping the moment he saw me, the smile he used for guests, for colleagues, for anyone he needed to impress. It never quite reached his eyes, but it was convincing enough from a distance. "You can't be here," he said, and there was an edge to it now, a warning. I nodded. I could feel the cold seeping through my coat, could see my breath in small clouds. "Okay, just tell Luke I'm proud of him." "We will," Mom said, already reaching for the gift, already closing the door. I turned and walked back down the driveway as the door closed behind me, shutting out the warmth and the music and the laughter. Shutting me out. I drove a few blocks away and parked under a streetlight. I turned off the radio and sat with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house I grew up in. The windows glowed warm against the winter night, golden rectangles of light that made the rest of the street look dark by comparison. Luke texted, "Things are tense. I'm sorry. We'll talk later." I stared at the message. Things are tense. As if the tension were weather, something that happened to everyone equally, something no one could control. I opened the trunk and looked at the garment bag. The fabric was smooth under my fingers, the zipper cold. I didn't unzip it. I just stood there for a moment in the dark, the streetlight casting my shadow long across the pavement, then closed the trunk and got back in the car. I imagined the guests inside seeing only the version of my family my parents had prepared. The polite son with the easy charm, the gracious hosts who knew exactly which wine to serve and which stories to tell, the respectable home with the right furniture and the right art and the right everything. I thought about how carefully they'd arranged it all, how much effort went into making sure nothing was out of place, nothing unexpected, nothing that might raise questions they didn't want to answer. I didn't know then that there was a framed photograph of me in uniform sitting near the fireplace, something I'd never seen before, something I hadn't known existed. I didn't know anyone would notice it. I didn't know that inside that room, while I sat outside in the cold, someone was looking at that photograph and recognizing the face. Being too embarrassing wasn't new. It had just been repackaged for this particular occasion, given a new justification, a fresh coat of reasonable-sounding concern. When I was a kid, Mom would smooth my hair too hard before church, her fingers tight and deliberate, pulling strands back so firmly it made my eyes water. She'd hiss instructions under her breath while we walked up the church steps. "Don't slouch, don't fidget, don't ask questions during the sermon, don't do anything that makes people look at us." Then she'd pinch my arm under the pew if I laughed too loud at something the pastor said, her nails leaving small crescents in my skin that lasted through Sunday dinner. I remember sitting at dinner tables while Dad told stories about work, about deals he'd closed or clients he'd impressed. He'd wait for the laughter, for the acknowledgement, and if I said anything that shifted attention or asked a follow-up question that led somewhere unexpected, he'd change the subject smoothly, redirecting back to safer ground. Dad shut down any question that made him look unsure in front of other adults. If I asked why something worked a certain way, he'd smile tightly and say, "We'll talk about it later," which meant never. If I pointed out something that didn't make sense, he'd say I was being difficult, being contrary, looking for problems where there weren't any. If I questioned a decision he'd made, even politely, he'd tell me I didn't have all the information, that adults understood things children couldn't, that I needed to trust him instead of always questioning everything. Luke was different. He had an easy grin that charmed people, a way of laughing that made adults lean in and smile back. He knew instinctively which questions to ask and which to avoid, how to make small talk that made people feel good about themselves. He could walk into a room full of strangers and within minutes have them relaxed and laughing, feeling like he'd known them for years. Dad would clap him on the shoulder in public and say, "That's my boy," his voice full of genuine pride, the kind I'd stopped waiting for somewhere around middle school. I'd watch from the edges of rooms while Luke held court, while people gravitated toward him naturally, while he made it look effortless. I learned early that my job was to stay small and not complicate the picture they wanted to show. If I did that well enough, if I stayed quiet enough and needed little enough and caused no problems, then maybe I'd earn a space at the edge of their approval. Not the center, where Luke stood effortlessly, but somewhere adjacent, somewhere tolerable. I learned which parts of myself to show and which to hide. I learned to watch their faces for signs of tension, to adjust my words before they landed wrong, to anticipate their reactions and head them off. I learned to make myself useful without being noticed, to help without expecting thanks, to be present without taking up space. When I got accepted to college, I was excited. I'd worked hard, kept my grades up despite working part-time, written essays that felt honest and real. I thought they'd be proud. Mom asked if I'd considered schools closer to home. Dad asked if I was sure I could handle the workload. They came to my graduation, sat in the audience, took photos. But the pride felt conditional, qualified, like they were proud I'd succeeded, but wished I'd done it differently. When I told them I was enlisting, there was a long silence on the phone. Mom asked if I'd thought it through. Dad asked if I understood what I was giving up. They didn't ask why I wanted to serve. They didn't ask about my reasons or my plans. They asked if I'd considered how it would look, how they'd explain it to people, what they'd say when friends asked what their daughter was doing. By the time I enlisted, I thought I'd outgrown needing their approval. I thought distance would make it easier, that building a life separate from theirs would free me from the old patterns. I thought if I just stopped expecting anything, I wouldn't be disappointed anymore. But sitting in my car that night, watching the glow from their windows, feeling the cold seep through the door seals, I realized the script hadn't changed. They still wanted me quiet. They still needed me out of frame. The only difference was that now they had better reasons, more sophisticated justifications. It wasn't about me being difficult anymore. It was about standards, about images, about not complicating things for other people. It was still about me being the problem. I drove home and sat in my apartment with the lights off. I didn't cry. I just felt tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. A tiredness that went deeper than exhaustion, that settled into my bones and made everything feel heavier. I thought about texting Luke something honest, something that didn't pretend everything was fine. But I knew how that conversation would go. He'd say he understood, that he wished things were different, that it wasn't personal, that Mom and Dad were just stressed about making a good impression, and maybe for him it wasn't personal. Maybe he really didn't see how the same pattern kept repeating, how I was always the one asked to step back, to sit out, to make myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. I sat in the silence, exhaled slowly, and gave God the weight I couldn't carry alone. I asked for peace in the middle of rejection, for the ability to let go without bitterness taking root. I asked for the grace to love my family without needing them to love me back the way I wanted. I didn't ask for vindication. I didn't ask for them to see what they were doing. I just asked to sleep without the weight of it crushing my chest. The next morning, I went to the base for my shift. I focused on the work, the steady routine that had carried me through harder things than family disappointment. Inventory checks, equipment maintenance, routine briefings with personnel rotating through. It felt steadier than thinking about the party I hadn't been allowed to attend, steadier than wondering if Luke had noticed I wasn't there, if anyone had asked about me, if my parents had told the lie they'd prepared about duty calling me away. I checked supply levels, restocked medical kits, reviewed protocols with newer medics who were still learning the difference between textbook procedures and field reality. The work had a rhythm to it, a logic that didn't depend on anyone's approval or disapproval. Either the equipment was ready or it wasn't. Either the protocols were followed or they weren't. There was clarity in that, a kind of honesty I didn't find in many other places. 3 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Maya Reynolds?" "Yes, this is Evelyn Carlisle. I'm Luke's future mother-in-law." I sat up straighter, my hand tightening on the phone. "Hello, Mrs. Carlisle. I saw a photograph of you at your parents' home on New Year's Eve," she said. Her voice was clear, direct, the kind of voice used to being listened to. "You were in uniform. It took me a moment, but I recognized you." My chest tightened. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." "Not formally," she said, "but my daughter served under you in a field evacuation 5 years ago, outside Kandahar. She was 22, badly injured, and you stayed on the ground until she was on the helicopter. She told me about it when she came home." The memory came back sharp and immediate. The dust, the noise, the way time compressed and expanded unpredictably. The decision to stay, to make sure everyone got out, to be the last one to leave because that's what the position required. I remembered that day with the kind of clarity that certain moments burn into you. We'd been conducting a routine medical assessment at a forward operating base when the situation deteriorated. Mortar fire, small arms, chaos, moving faster than anyone expected. The call came to evacuate, helicopter inbound, personnel prioritized by injury severity and mission criticality. Her daughter had been hit during the initial barrage. Shrapnel wounds, significant blood loss, conscious but deteriorating. I'd stabilized her as best I could with the equipment we had, started IV fluids, applied pressure dressings, kept her talking so she'd stay conscious. The helicopter came in under fire. Dust everywhere, visibility down to almost nothing, the noise so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. People were loading, moving fast, everyone focused on getting out before the situation got worse. I remember looking at her daughter's face. 22 years old, same age I'd been when I enlisted. Scared but trying not to show it, trying to stay calm because panic would make everything worse. I told her she was getting on that helicopter, that she was going home, that this wasn't her last day. I stayed on the ground, making sure the wounded got loaded first, keeping count, maintaining position while others evacuated. Another medic told me to go, said I'd done my part, but I couldn't leave until I knew everyone was accounted for. It wasn't about being heroic. It was about the responsibility you accept when you put on the uniform, when you take the position, when people depend on you to hold your line. When the helicopter finally lifted off with her daughter secure inside, I felt the weight lift. Not relief exactly, but the confirmation that the decision had been right, that staying had mattered. I was doing my job, I managed, pulling myself back to the present, to Evelyn's voice on the phone. "You saved her life," Evelyn said, her voice firm, leaving no room for deflection. "She told me you held the line when others pulled back. She said you were the reason she made it out. She said she'd never met anyone who stayed that calm when everything was falling apart." I didn't know what to say. I'd never expected the story to travel, never expected anyone to connect the medic on the ground that day with Luke's sister years later. "And I'm calling because I want to meet you properly," Evelyn continued. "There's an engagement dinner next week at my home. I'd like you to be there. I insist on it, actually. Mrs. Carlisle, I appreciate that, but my parents think it's better if I keep a low profile. They have their reasons." "I'm not asking your parents," she said, and there was steel underneath the politeness. "I'm asking you. You're Luke's sister. You'll be part of this family. And I won't have you excluded from my table because of someone else's discomfort." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a tone that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being argued with. "All right," I said quietly. "Good," Evelyn said. "I'll send you the details. And Maya, wear whatever makes you comfortable. You don't need to blend in, you just need to be there. When I called Luke to confirm, he sounded strained, his voice tight in the way it got when he was caught between competing expectations. Mom and Dad are going to lose it, he said. Mrs. Carlyle invited me directly. I know she did. But they're already panicking. They're saying you need to keep things simple. Don't mention the service stuff unless someone specifically asks. Don't make it about you. Just let the evening happen without complications. I could feel the old pattern pulling at me, the instinct to smooth it over, to make myself smaller so everyone else could breathe easier. The habit of apologizing for taking up space, for being the kind of person who complicated things just by existing. I'm not planning to make it about anything, I said, but I'm not going to pretend I'm someone else. Luke was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him rubbing his forehead the way he did when he was stressed. Just try to blend in, okay? For me, this is important to her family and I need it to go well. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to make it easy for him to be the sister who caused no problems, who made his life simpler instead of harder. But something in me refused. I'll be respectful, I said. I'll be polite. But I won't blend in by disappearing, not this time. When I hung up, I felt the weight of it settle over me. I wasn't trying to start a fight. I wasn't trying to prove anything or make a point, but I also wasn't going to erase myself to make their story work. I'd spent too many years doing that already, and it had never been enough anyway. The day of the dinner, Mom called. We need to set some ground rules, she said. No preamble, no greeting. Don't bring up the military unless someone specifically asks about it. Don't mention anything that might make the Carlyles uncomfortable. Don't talk about deployments or anything political. Just be polite and let the evening happen. Can you do that? I'm always polite, I said. You know what I mean. I did. She meant, don't be visible. Don't be yourself. Don't be anything that requires explanation or draws attention or makes people ask questions about why you're different from what they expected. When I arrived at Evelyn Carlyle's home that evening, it was everything my parents had wanted to impress. A wide circular driveway, tall windows that glowed with warm light, elegant landscaping that looked carefully maintained, even in winter. I wore a simple dress, dark and understated, and carried nothing but my keys. I'd thought about bringing wine, about some gesture that would signal I understood the evening's formality, but decided against it. Evelyn had been clear about what she wanted, me there as myself without performance. Evelyn met me at the door before I could ring the bell. She was poised, direct, and warm in a way that didn't feel performative, that seemed to come from genuine conviction rather than social training. Maya, she said, taking my hand in both of hers. I'm so glad you're here. My parents were already inside, standing near the fireplace with tight smiles. They'd positioned themselves where they could see the door, where they could monitor who arrived and how. Luke and his fiancée were across the room talking with an older couple I didn't recognize. When my parents saw me, Dad's jaw tightened. Mom looked at the floor. Evelyn didn't wait. She didn't let me hover in the entryway, didn't let me slip quietly into a corner. She guided me by the elbow into the center of the room and raised her voice just enough to gather attention without making it feel forced. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Maya Reynolds, she said, and the conversations quieted. Luke's sister. She served as a medic in the army and was directly responsible for saving my daughter's life during a field evacuation. The room went quiet, not awkward quiet, but the kind of quiet that happens when people are genuinely listening, when something real has been said that cuts through the polite surface. Dad's face went pale. Mom looked at the floor, her hands clasped in front of her. Maya stayed on the ground when others evacuated, Evelyn continued, her voice steady and clear. She made sure my daughter got out safely, even when the situation was deteriorating. I owe her more than I can say, and I wanted everyone here to know it. I felt every eye in the room on me. I kept my expression steady, my shoulders straight. I kept my voice even, choosing peace over proving anything, and let James 1:19 guide me, quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. I was doing my job, I said quietly. Any medic would have done the same. You did more than that, Evelyn said, and I wanted everyone here to know exactly who you are and what you've done. She raised her glass. Ooh, Maya. A few people echoed the toast, raising their own glasses. My parents didn't move. The dinner itself was elegant, carefully orchestrated, the kind of meal where every course had been planned and every detail considered. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. Soft music played from speakers I couldn't see. The table was set with china that looked like it had been in the family for generations. I sat between Luke's fiancé's uncle and a family friend, both of whom asked genuine questions about my service, about what it was like to work in field hospitals, about the decision to enlist in the first place. They asked with real curiosity, not the polite but distant interest people sometimes showed when they didn't know what else to say. The uncle had served in Vietnam decades ago, and he asked specific questions about how medical protocols had changed, about equipment and procedures, and the differences between then and now. We talked about the challenge of maintaining care standards in austere environments, about the training that prepared you for impossible decisions, about the weight you carried long after you came home. The family friend asked about deployments, about what drew me to medical work specifically. I told her about wanting to help people in the most difficult moments of their lives, about the clarity that came with having a defined role and purpose, about the satisfaction of knowing your skills made a difference in outcomes that mattered. I answered honestly but briefly, trying to find the balance between being myself and not dominating the conversation. I talked about the work without glorifying it, about the reality without dwelling on the hardest parts, about my experience without making it sound like something it wasn't. I could feel my parents watching from across the table, could sense their tension every time someone directed a question my way, every time the conversation circled back to my service. Mom kept trying to redirect, asking about the food, commenting on the decor, bringing up neutral topics that would shift focus away from me. Dad ate methodically, his expression controlled, his participation minimal. At one point, Evelyn's husband asked about the decision to pursue paramedicine alongside military service, about how those paths intersected and informed each other. I explained how the training complemented each other, how field experience made you better at managing complex situations with limited resources, how the discipline and protocols translated across different contexts. I could see Mom tense across the table, her hands gripping her napkin. But I wasn't going to lie or deflect or pretend my career didn't exist. I had spent too many years doing that already. After dinner, I stepped outside for air. The garden was quiet, lit by soft pathway lights that cast gentle shadows across carefully maintained flower beds. I could hear voices inside, laughter and the clink of glasses, the sound of people enjoying themselves. Luke found me a few minutes later. "That was intense," he said, leaning against the stone railing beside me. "I didn't plan it." "I know." He looked out at the garden, his hands in his pockets. "Mom and Dad are furious. Dad's barely said a word since the toast. Mom keeps trying to change the subject every time someone brings up your service." "They usually are," I said. He looked at me. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you before." "At the party. I should have insisted you be there. You were trying to keep the peace." "Yeah," he said. "But maybe that wasn't fair to you. Maybe I've been asking you to carry too much for too long, just so I don't have to deal with their reactions." I didn't answer right away. I wanted to believe he meant it. But I'd heard apologies before that didn't change anything, that were more about relieving guilt than actually shifting behavior. "Just don't let them erase me again," I said. "I won't," he said. "I promise." That Sunday, I drove to my parents' house unannounced. I'd spent the morning at church, sitting in the back pew the way I usually did, listening to a sermon about truth and grace and the cost of living honestly. I needed to say something I'd been holding back for too long, something that wouldn't get easier with more time. Dad opened the door, surprised to see me. He was in weekend clothes, reading glasses still on his head, clearly not expecting company. "We need to talk," I said. He let me in, and Mom appeared from the kitchen, already defensive, her shoulders already set in that particular way that meant she was preparing for conflict. I didn't sit down. I stayed standing in the living room where I'd spent so many years trying to be small enough, trying to take up so little space that maybe they'd forget to be disappointed in me. "I know you're upset about the dinner," I said, "but I need you to hear this. I'm not going to be someone you crop out of the family picture anymore." "We never said that," Mom said quickly, automatically. "You didn't have to say it," I said. "You've been doing it my whole life. And I let you because I thought if I stayed quiet enough, if I needed little enough, if I caused no problems and asked for nothing, you'd finally be proud of me." Dad crossed his arms. "This isn't about pride." "Then what is it about?" I asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it's about you being ashamed of me. It's about me being the daughter you have to manage, the complication you have to explain, the person who doesn't fit the story you want to tell about yourselves." "We're not ashamed," Mom said, but her voice cracked slightly and she looked away. "Then why did you turn me away from Luke's party? Why did you tell me not to mention my service at the dinner? Why do you keep acting like I'm the liability you need to manage instead of your daughter?" They didn't answer. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. I looked at the mantel above the fireplace. The framed photograph of me in uniform was gone. There was a gap where it had been, a slight difference in the dust pattern that showed something had recently been moved. "Where's the photo?" I asked. Mom looked away. "We moved it." "Because it embarrassed you, because it complicated things," Dad said, his voice flat. "Because Evelyn Carlisle saw it and made assumptions, and now we're dealing with the consequences of that." I felt something shift inside me, something that had been bending for years, finally reaching its limit. "I'm done making myself smaller so you can feel comfortable," I said. "I'm done pretending I'm someone I'm not just so you don't have to explain me to people. If you want me in Luke's life, in this family, I'll be there. But I won't be there on the condition that I pretend to be someone else." I refused bitterness, but held the line, trusting Proverbs 3:5-6, "Lean not on my own understanding, but on God's direction, on a path that might not make sense to them, but was still the right one." I turned and walked out before they could respond, before they could tell me I was being dramatic or unfair or unreasonable. I'd said what I needed to say. What they did with it was up to them. A week later, I was called to a ceremony on base. It was a recognition event for long service personnel, nothing I'd been expecting or particularly looking forward to. These events were usually routine, brief acknowledgments of time served, nothing that required family attendance. The notification had come through official channels, a formal invitation that suggested I should attend, but didn't explain why I was being specifically recognized. I called Luke to let him know, not expecting him to care particularly. But he asked for the details, asked if it was okay if he told our parents, asked if I wanted them there or preferred they stay away. "It's up to you," I said. "I'm not going to invite them, but I won't stop you from telling them." "They should be there," he said. "They should see this." I didn't argue with him. Part of me hoped they'd come. Part of me hoped they wouldn't. I didn't know which outcome would be harder. The day of the ceremony, I arrived early to prepare. The event was held in one of the base's larger assembly halls, rows of chairs arranged to face the platform with the podium and flags. Other personnel were gathering, some in dress uniform like me, others in service dress, all of us unsure exactly what to expect. A commanding officer briefed us before the event started. We'd each be called forward, citations would be read, photographs would be taken. Standard recognition protocol, but with more formality than usual. He mentioned that families had been invited, that this was meant to acknowledge service in a way that included the people who supported us. I stood on the platform in my dress uniform, while a commanding officer read citations and achievements, my record laid out in official language that made the messy reality sound clean and organized. He talked about years of service, about deployment rotations, about specific incidents where decisions had mattered. My parents were in the audience. Luke had told them about it, and they'd come. I saw them sitting in the third row, Dad in a dark suit, Mom in a dress she usually reserved for important occasions. They sat straight, their faces carefully neutral, their hands folded in their laps. When my name was called, the officer mentioned the evacuation. He talked about the decision I'd made to stay on the ground, to ensure every person got out before I did, to maintain position under deteriorating conditions because that's what the situation required. He called it an example of integrity under pressure, of the kind of leadership that sustained units in difficult circumstances. He mentioned specific details I'd forgotten, things that had been documented in after-action reports, decisions that had seemed obvious at the time but looked different when described in official language. He talked about maintaining medical care under fire, about prioritizing casualties while managing limited resources, about the judgment required when every second mattered and there were no second chances to get it right. I kept my eyes forward, my expression steady. I'd learned a long time ago that ceremonies weren't about the individual, weren't about pride or recognition. They were about the institution acknowledging certain behaviors as worth repeating, worth passing on to the next generation of personnel who would face similar situations. I saw my parents in the third row. Dad's face was unreadable, that careful mask he wore when he was processing something he didn't want to show. Mom's eyes were on her hands, her fingers twisted together in her lap. I wondered what they were thinking, whether they were proud or uncomfortable, or something more complicated than either. After the ceremony, a retired officer approached me. He was older, gray-haired, with the kind of bearing that suggested decades of service. His uniform was pressed with the kind of precision that came from habit, not requirement. "I served with some of the personnel from that unit," he said. "They told me you held your line when it mattered. That's not common. That's the kind of thing people remember years later." "Thank you, sir," I said. He nodded, shook my hand firmly, and moved on to speak with someone else. Dad was standing a few feet away, close enough to hear. He didn't say anything. He didn't congratulate me, didn't acknowledge the officer's words, didn't move to join the conversation. He just stood there listening, his face still carefully neutral, his hands at his sides. Luke approached with his fiancée, both of them smiling. He hugged me quickly. "That was impressive," he said. "I didn't know half of that stuff." "It's just the job," I said. "It's not just the job," his fiancée said quietly. What he described, that was more than just doing the job. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. When we left, Dad walked beside me to the parking lot but didn't speak. Mom was ahead of us, already at the car, already looking at her phone, her shoulders tense. The silence felt heavy, full of all the things we weren't saying. "Thank you for coming," I said. He nodded once. "You did well up there. It wasn't much." It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of everything that had happened. It wasn't a conversation about why they'd excluded me, or why my service embarrassed them, or why they'd spent so long trying to manage how I appeared in the world. But it was something, a small shift, barely noticeable, but there. 2 weeks later, the rehearsal dinner arrived. It was smaller than the engagement dinner, just close family, and the wedding party, held at a restaurant Luke and his fiancée had chosen. I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome, but Evelyn had sent me an invitation directly, a formal card with my name written in careful calligraphy. When I walked in, she greeted me the same way she had before, warm, deliberate, unbothered by any tension my presence might cause. "Maya," she said, "right on time." The room was arranged with a long table, place cards set at each seat. My parents were already there, talking quietly with Luke's future in-laws. Luke and his fiancée stood near the window, his arm around her waist, both of them looking more relaxed than I'd seen them in weeks. During the toast, Luke stood and talked about his fiancée, about how they'd met, about the life they were building together. He told stories that made people laugh, that showed the kind of easy charm he'd always had, the ability to make moments feel lighter and warmer just by being himself. Then he paused and looked around the table. "I also want to say something about my sister," he said. I looked up, surprised. This wasn't part of the usual script, wasn't something we'd discussed. "Maya couldn't make it to our engagement party," he said, and the room went quiet. "And that was my fault. I should have made sure she was there. I should have insisted on it. But I'm glad she's here now. And I'm glad she's going to be part of our lives going forward." He looked directly at me. "Not as a compromise, not with conditions, as my sister." I nodded, my throat tight. Across the table, Dad looked down at his plate. Mom took a sip of water. After the toast, people mingled, conversation flowing more easily now that the formal part was over. I found myself talking with Luke's fiancée for the first time, without my parents hovering nearby, without the weight of their expectations pressing down on every word. "I'm sorry about the party," she said quietly. "I didn't know you'd been told not to come. That wasn't what I wanted. It's not your fault," I said. "Still," she said, "I'm glad you're here now. Luke talks about you a lot. I'd like to get to know you better." It was a simple statement, but it meant something. An invitation without conditions, without qualifications. The wedding was in late spring. White chairs arranged on a wide lawn, the ceremony simple and elegant, the kind of day where everything felt possible. The venue was beautiful in an understated way, old trees providing natural shade, flowers arranged with care but not ostentation. The air smelled like cut grass and lilacs. When I arrived, there was a place card with my name at a table near the front, not tucked in the back where I could be overlooked, not at the family table where my presence would be conditional. Just a seat, clearly labeled, positioned where I'd have a clear view of the ceremony. Maya Reynolds. No qualifiers, no conditions, no asterisks. I picked up the card, felt the weight of the heavy paper, the careful calligraphy. It was such a small thing, but it meant something. It meant I hadn't been forgotten, hadn't been considered optional, hadn't been squeezed in at the last minute as an afterthought. I sat down, smoothed my dress, and looked around. Evelyn smiled at me from across the aisle, a small nod of acknowledgement. She was wearing a dress that looked elegant without trying too hard, her hair styled simply. She looked genuinely happy. The kind of happiness that comes from seeing something you've worked toward finally happening. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Luke looked happy in a way I hadn't seen in years, his usual charm replaced by something deeper and more genuine. He stood at the altar with his hands clasped, watching the aisle, waiting. When his bride appeared, his face lit up with pure joy, unguarded and real. His fiancée, his wife now, was radiant, her smile wide and real. She walked down the aisle with her father, her dress moving in the slight breeze, her eyes locked on Luke. They said their vows clearly, without hesitation, their voices carrying across the lawn. I watched Luke promise to be honest, to be present, to show up as himself, without pretense. I watched him promise to build a life based on truth, not image. I wondered if he was thinking about everything that had happened, about the party where I'd been excluded, about the dinners where I'd been acknowledged, about the choices he'd made, and the ones he was making now. During the reception, Evelyn gave a short speech about family and the people we choose to honor. She talked about building connections based on truth, about refusing to let important people be diminished or erased. She talked about integrity, about the courage it takes to see people clearly and love them anyway. She mentioned me by name again, thanking me for the role I'd played in her daughter's life, for the decision I'd made to stay when others left. She said my actions had given her family a gift they could never repay, that knowing her daughter was alive because someone had held their line was something she thought about every single day. The crowd was quiet, listening. Some people looked at me. I kept my expression steady, my hands folded in my lap. My parents sat 2 tables away. They didn't clap, but they didn't leave either. They sat through the speech, through the acknowledgement, through the moment that made it clear I wasn't going to disappear. Dad looked at his plate. Mom looked at the centerpiece. Neither of them looked at me. I wondered what they were feeling. Embarrassment that their daughter was being acknowledged in ways they hadn't approved? Resentment that Evelyn kept highlighting my service? Regret for how they'd handled things? I couldn't tell. Their faces gave nothing away. Later, after the official toast, after the first dance, after the cake had been cut and the photographer had corralled people for group photos, I stepped outside for a moment just to breathe. The evening air was cool, spring edging towards summer, and I could hear music drifting through the open doors. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, turning everything golden. String lights were starting to show against the darkening sky, warm points of light strung between the trees. I stepped outside, prayed a quiet thanks for dignity that didn't need their approval, and let the evening settle around me. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed she had to shrink to belong, the one who made herself quiet in church, who learned which questions not to ask, who watched Luke charm adults and wondered why she couldn't do the same, the one who thought love was something you earned by being less. I thought about all the years I spent waiting for them to see me, to be proud, to let me in without conditions. I thought about how much energy I poured into being small, into being manageable, into being the daughter who caused no problems and required no explanations. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my words, adjusted my presence, made myself less visible so they could be more comfortable. I wasn't waiting anymore. I'd been waiting my whole life for permission to exist fully, for approval to be myself, for the signal that I was finally acceptable. But standing there in the evening air, listening to music and laughter from inside, I understood something I'd been moving toward for months. The approval wasn't coming, not the way I'd imagined it. Not clean and clear and unqualified. My parents might shift slightly, might acknowledge me when forced by circumstances, might sit through ceremonies and speeches where I was recognized. But they weren't going to wake up one day and suddenly see me differently, suddenly feel proud without reservations, suddenly want me exactly as I was. And that was okay, not because I didn't matter, not because their opinion wasn't important, but because I couldn't build my life around waiting for something that might never come. I couldn't keep making myself smaller, hoping it would finally be small enough. I couldn't keep erasing parts of myself, hoping that what remained would be acceptable. When I went back inside, Luke was dancing with his wife. The floor was full of people moving to slow music, couples swaying together, the DJ reading the room perfectly. He saw me across the room and waved me over, his face open and happy. I joined them on the floor, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was trespassing in my own family. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, without apology, without negotiation. Luke's wife smiled at me. "I'm so glad you're here," she said. "Me too," I said, and meant it. I didn't know if my parents would ever fully accept me. I didn't know if they'd apologize, or admit they'd been wrong, or stop trying to manage how I appeared in their world. I didn't know if they'd ever look at me and feel proud without qualifications, without the silent wish that I were different in some fundamental way. But I knew I didn't need them to. I'd spent so long believing that love was something I had to earn by being less. Less visible, less complicated, less myself, less present, less demanding, less real. I thought that if I just made myself small enough, if I just needed little enough, if I just caused few enough problems, then maybe I'd finally be enough for them. But that night, standing under the string lights with my brother and the people who'd chosen to see me, I realized the truth that had been waiting all along. I didn't need to be less. I just needed to stop waiting for permission to be enough. The music played on. People danced and laughed and celebrated the beginning of something new. I stayed until the last song, until the lights came up and people started gathering their things, until Luke hugged me goodnight and told me he was glad I'd been there. And when I left whole.